In a world where empires rose and fell like shadows at dusk, one man stood at the center of it all, Napoleon Bonaparte. A genius of war, a master of strategy, and yet a single day would seal his fate forever. The fields of Waterloo became more than just battlegrounds. They became the wall between power and downfall, between glory and ruin. And tonight we journey back to that day, a day where nations collided, where cannons roared, where history itself was rewritten in fire and blood. This isn't just about a battle, it's about betrayal, ambition, and the fall of a legend. Stay with us as we uncover secrets that textbooks often leave behind. And before we dive into the walls of mystery and the echoes of history, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments, because together we keep the past alive. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise is nothing short of breathtaking, an ascent so fast, so unexpected, it stunned both allies and enemies across Europe. He was not born into a wealthy dynasty, nor did he inherit a throne. Instead, he carved his path through sheer brilliance and ambition. From the windswept island of Corsica, a young artillery officer would emerge to become a name that echoed in every royal court and every battlefield. His rise began in the chaos of the French Revolution, a time when kings trembled, when the old world cracked like shattered glass, and when opportunity was everywhere for those bold enough to seize it. Napoleon was that man. He saw not just the battlefield, but the board game of power, where every move, every sacrifice, every calculated risk could lead him closer to destiny. It was during the siege of Toulon in 1793 that Napoleon first showed the world his fire. Barely in his 20s, he designed artillery tactics that forced the British to retreat. In that moment, the French army saw not just an officer, but a leader who could turn defeat into victory. His brilliance was a spark, and soon that spark lit a fire across the Republic. Each promotion came faster than the last, until by 1796 he was leading the army of Italy. Against larger, better equipped enemies, Napoleon crushed Austrian forces again and again, moving with such speed and precision that entire armies seemed to collapse in his wake. He turned battles into lightning strikes where maneuver mattered more than numbers, where his soldiers, fueled by his words, fought with a belief that they were invincible. And Napoleon knew the power of words. He could stand before hungry, ragged soldiers and with a single speech transform despair into determination. He promised them glory, honor, and above all, the chance to shape history with their own hands. His charisma was a weapon sharper than any blade. By the time he marched into Egypt in 1798, Napoleon was not just a general, he was a legend in the making. Though that campaign ended with setbacks, it did little to tarnish the image of the young conqueror. France adored him, the army idolized him, and even his enemies could not deny his genius. Then came his most daring move, not on a battlefield, but in the heart of politics. In 1799, seizing on the weakness of the Directory government, Napoleon staged a coup. In a single stroke, he transformed himself from general to first consul, the most powerful man in France. It was a revolution within a revolution, a reminder that his ambition had no ceiling. His reforms rebuilt France's shattered economy, stabilized its laws, and restored a sense of pride. And in 1804, with the eyes of Europe upon him, Napoleon crowned himself emperor, not waiting for a pope, not waiting for permission, but lifting the crown and placing it on his own head. The symbolism was clear. He owed his throne to no one but himself. By now, Europe understood the scale of the storm they faced. Napoleon was not just a soldier, not just a politician. He was a force of nature. In the years that followed, his empire expanded like wildfire, stretching from Spain to the borders of Russia. He redrew maps, toppled monarchs, and installed his family on thrones. At Austerlitz, at Jena, at Wagram, he seemed unstoppable. Yet with every victory, the seeds of his downfall were being planted. His rise was meteoric, dazzling, and terrifying, but in its brilliance, it cast long shadows. The same ambition that lifted him from Corsica's shores to Europe's thrones would one day drive him to the fields of Waterloo, where the wall of destiny waited to halt him forever. As Napoleon's shadow stretched across Europe, it became clear that no single nation could stop him. One by one, kingdoms and empires had felt the crushing weight of his armies. Austria humbled, Prussia broke, and Spain occupied. Italy transformed into satellite states. To many rulers, it seemed as though the French emperor could not be defeated. Yet in the ashes of repeated defeats, a quiet resolve began to grow among his enemies. If they could not stand alone, then they would have to stand together. Thus, the great coalition against Napoleon was born, not out of friendship, but out of necessity. Old rivals, bound by fear of one man's ambition, forged uneasy alliances that would shape the fate of Europe. Britain, the island fortress, was the first and most persistent enemy. For years, it had stood defiant, its powerful navy blocking French ships and choking Napoleon's dreams of world dominance. Britain supplied money, weapons, and resources to anyone willing to fight France. To Napoleon, Britain was like a thorn he could never pull out, untouchable by land, yet constantly undermining his every move. Still, even Britain's gold and ships were not enough. They needed men on the ground, armies that could stand toe to toe with Napoleon's legions. And so the call went out across Europe. Prussia, once humiliated by crushing defeats at Jena and Auerstedt, longed for revenge. The scars of their losses still burned, and the memory of Napoleon's triumphs haunted their pride, yet they rebuilt, rearmed, and waited for the moment to strike. Russia, vast and unpredictable, had once been an uneasy ally of France, but Napoleon's disastrous invasion of 1812 turned the Tsar's nation into a sworn enemy. Their endless lands and bitter winters had bled the French army dry, and now Russia stood ready to return the favor on European soil. Austria, too, though beaten time and again, understood that Napoleon's ambitions would never leave them in peace. Their survival depended on joining the coalition. By 1815, the pieces had aligned. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia all had sworn to bring down the emperor once and for all. And behind them stood not just governments, but people who were weary of endless war, weary of watching their lands trampled by French boots, weary of living under the shadow of Napoleon's victories. It was no longer about single battles or lost territory. It was about the balance of Europe itself. If Napoleon triumphed once more, then no king, no nation, no tradition would be safe. Yet alliances are fragile things. These powers were not natural friends. They were bitter rivals with centuries of conflict between them. Britain and France had clashed for generations. Prussia and Austria distrusted each other, and Russia eyed both with suspicion. But in this moment of crisis, they bound themselves with one common vow: Napoleon must be stopped. The Duke of Wellington, commanding British and Allied forces, and Gebhard von Blücher, leading the Prussians, became central figures in this final struggle. Their coordination, their trust in one another, would mean the difference between victory and ruin. For Napoleon, this was a nightmare come to life. He had returned from exile, raised a new army, and sought to strike before his enemies could fully unite. But the wall of resistance had already been built. The coalition was determined, disciplined, and fueled by a single, unbreakable purpose: to end his reign forever. The fields of Belgium would soon bear witness to this clash of titans, a battle not just of armies, but of ideals. Napoleon's empire stood on one side, the fragile but determined alliance of Europe on the other. The Allies were not perfect, but together they formed a force stronger than ambition, stronger than strategy, stronger than one man's will. In unity, they would attempt what none could do alone: topple the greatest general of their age. The fields of Waterloo were more than just open ground. They were destiny carved into soil and stone. Nestled in present-day Belgium, the terrain was deceptively ordinary: rolling hills, farmland, hedgerows, and narrow country roads. But in June of 1815, this quiet countryside became the stage for one of the most dramatic confrontations in human history. It was here that Europe's fate would be decided, where an emperor's dream would shatter, and where a wall of resistance would rise against one man's ambition. Napoleon chose the battlefield with the sharp eye of a master strategist. He understood terrain the way an artist understands canvas. The ridge at Mont Saint-Jean offered the Allies, under the Duke of Wellington, a strong defensive position, but it also tempted Napoleon. He believed his artillery, his cavalry, and his fearsome Imperial Guard could break through that wall of men and earth. To him, Waterloo was not just another battlefield. It was an opportunity to strike fast, crush the British before the Prussians could arrive, and reassert his dominance over Europe. He saw it as his chance to rewrite the story of his exile, to prove that the eagle of France could still soar. Yet the land itself was not kind to him. Rain had pounded the fields the night before, turning farmland into a swamp of mud and misery. Cannons bogged down, horses stumbled, soldiers trudged through muck that slowed every step. The ground that Napoleon had hoped would give him speed instead stole it away. Every cannonball sank deep, every charge lost momentum, every maneuver was delayed. In a war where timing meant everything, the weather itself had turned traitor. Wellington, on the other hand, understood the strength of patience. His forces, British, Dutch, Belgian, and German allies, lined the ridge like a living fortress. Farmhouses such as Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte became anchors of resistance, small strongholds that Napoleon could not ignore. Each attack the French launched met walls of determination. At Hougoumont, French forces hurled themselves against stone and fire, only to be pushed back again and again. At La Haye-Sainte, desperate fighting raged as defenders held their ground to the last, buying precious hours for the Allied line. These farmhouses became symbols of grit, tiny citadels whose defense would ripple across the battle. Napoleon's strategy was simple in theory but complex in execution: pound the enemy with artillery, weaken their center, then send wave after wave of infantry and cavalry to shatter their formation. Yet every attempt was met with stubborn resistance. French cavalry charges thundered across the fields, glistening helmets and drawn sabers flashing in the sun. But when the dust cleared, the Allied infantry still stood, forming squares that bristled with bayonets, defying the momentum of the charge. It was as though the land itself, soaked with rain and blood, refused to yield. Still, Napoleon believed the day was his. He had broken countless armies before, and he trusted in his veterans to do it again. What he did not fully grasp was how much the battlefield favored Wellington's patience and how desperately time was working against him. Beyond the hills, Prussian forces under Blücher were already advancing, marching closer with every hour. Waterloo was not just a battlefield of muskets and cannons. It was a race against time, a waiting game where every delay, every failed assault brought Napoleon closer to disaster. The battlefield of Waterloo became a wall in every sense: geographical, psychological, and historical. The ridge at Mont Saint-Jean was the Allies' shield, the mud was nature's barrier, and the determination of Wellington's men was the final defense. For Napoleon, it was like charging against a stone wall that refused to crack, no matter how much firepower he unleashed. And as the sun climbed higher, the stage was set for the decisive blows that would either restore an empire or bury it beneath the soil of Belgium forever. The turning point at Waterloo did not come with a single cannon shot or a single charge. It came with the slow, relentless arrival of an army that Napoleon had hoped to keep at bay. As the battle raged on through the afternoon of June 18, 1815, all eyes were fixed on the clash between French and Allied forces. But far beyond the immediate field of combat, another force was on the move: the Prussian army under Marshal Gebhard von Blücher. Their march toward the battlefield would become the moment that broke Napoleon's grand design. Napoleon knew the Prussians were dangerous. Just days earlier at the Battle of Ligny, he had defeated them, scattering their forces and believing they would retreat far from the campaign. But Blücher was not a man easily broken. Though battered, bloodied, and nearly killed in the fighting, he refused to abandon the struggle. Instead, he rallied his men, reorganized his army, and made a vow they would join Wellington at Waterloo, no matter the cost. For the Allies, this determination was more than strategy, it was salvation. For Napoleon, it was the beginning of the end. As the hours passed, Napoleon launched attack after attack against Wellington's defensive line. His men threw themselves against Hougoumont, against La Haye-Sainte, against the ridge where Allied soldiers stood like walls of steel. But with each passing moment, his strength was bleeding away. His artillery fire was softened by the mud, his cavalry charges failed to break the squares, and his infantry could not force a decisive collapse. Napoleon's greatest fear was that time was no longer his ally, and on that battlefield, time was everything. Around mid-afternoon, reports reached Napoleon the Prussians were coming. At first, their presence seemed distant, perhaps even manageable. But soon, the thunder of their advance became undeniable. Columns of Prussian soldiers, weary yet unbroken, began to pour into the fight. They struck the French right flank with ferocity, adding fresh strength to a battle already draining Napoleon's reserves. For Wellington, who had been clinging to his defensive line all day, the sight of the Prussians was a lifeline. He had promised to hold until nightfall, knowing help would come, and now that promise was fulfilled. Napoleon attempted to counter this disaster with desperate brilliance. He sent forces under Marshal Grouchy to block the Prussians, but Grouchy had marched too far away, chasing shadows of the defeated army at Ligny. He was too distant to stop Blücher in time. Napoleon was forced to divert precious troops from his main assault to deal with the new threat, weakening the blows he was trying to land against Wellington. The French army, once an unstoppable hammer, now found itself being struck from two sides, pinned by the Allies in front and crushed by the Prussians on the flank. The momentum of the battle shifted. What had once been a contest of endurance became a tide of collapse. The Prussians surged forward, their arrival igniting hope among the exhausted Allied ranks. Soldiers who had been pushed to their limits suddenly found new strength, fighting with the knowledge that reinforcements were at their side. For the French, the sight was devastating, their emperor's plan unraveling, their numbers thinning, their confidence faltering. The turning point of Waterloo was not dramatic in a single instant. It was the slow suffocation of Napoleon's strategy by the weight of Allied unity. The wall he had hoped to break through in Wellington's line became unbreakable once the Prussians arrived. Every move he made was answered by fresh resistance. Every hope of seizing victory slipped further from his grasp, and as daylight began to fade, the emperor who had once commanded Europe stood trapped between two enemies who refused to yield. This was the moment the tide turned against him forever. The arrival of Blücher's Prussians transformed a brutal contest into a decisive defeat. Napoleon's genius, his courage, his relentless will, none of it could withstand the crushing reality of Allied numbers and timing. Waterloo's turning point was not just the joining of two armies, it was the collapse of a dream, the undoing of an empire, and the first cracks in the wall that would finally bury Napoleon's legend beneath the soil of history. As the sun sank lower over Waterloo, the battlefield was drenched in smoke, mud, and blood. The thunder of cannons had become the heartbeat of the day, echoing across the rolling fields as though the earth itself trembled under the weight of history. Napoleon, the man who had once bent Europe to his will, still believed he could snatch victory from the jaws of disaster. His army was battered but not broken. His opponents were wary, their lines stretched thin. And so, in a moment of desperation, wrapped in defiance, Napoleon prepared to unleash his last reserve, his final gamble, the Imperial Guard. The Guard was no ordinary force. They were his veterans, his chosen warriors, the men who had marched with him across Europe, from Austerlitz to Wagram, from Jena to Borodino. The French army, they were more than soldiers. They were living symbols of invincibility. The Guard had never broken in battle, never failed Napoleon. Their presence alone inspired fear in his enemies and pride in his own troops. They were the wall of iron he had always relied upon when victory seemed uncertain. And now, with his empire hanging in the balance, Napoleon turned once more to his most trusted sons. He rallied them with words meant to burn into their hearts. The Guard will advance, he commanded, and the exhausted remnants of his army watched as the columns formed, drums beating, eagles raised high. The sight was electric. Even the Allied soldiers who had fought bravely all day felt a tremor of dread as they saw the dark mass of French veterans moving forward with the weight of destiny. This was no ordinary attack. It was Napoleon himself throwing his last strength into the fight, wagering everything on one decisive blow. Across the ridge, Wellington's men braced for impact. They had held against cavalry, endured bombardments, and survived endless assaults, but this was different. The Guard carried an aura of invincibility, a myth that had grown with every campaign. If they succeeded in piercing the line, the battle could still be lost. Silence fell for a heartbeat as the French columns marched, steady and relentless, their bayonets gleaming through the smoke. Then the storm broke. Musket fire erupted, cannon blasts tore into the advancing ranks, and the ridge became a wall of flame and iron. Still, the Guard pressed on step by step. They climbed the slope, their discipline unshaken, their courage unbroken. Allied troops wavered but did not collapse. Then, at the critical moment, Wellington gave the order. British Guards rose from the ground where they had been lying in concealment, unleashing a devastating volley at close range. The French guard staggered, their ranks torn apart, yet they still advanced, determined to carve open the enemy line. A second volley thundered, then a third. The once unstoppable columns faltered, slowed, and finally broke. For the first time in their proud history, the Imperial Guard was repelled. The shock was immediate and devastating. Whispers spread like wildfire. "La Garde recule! The Guard retreats!" The words cut through the French army like a knife. If the Guard could be broken, then no one was invincible. Panic began to ripple through the ranks. Confidence gave way to fear, fear to chaos. Soldiers who had stood firm all day began to waver, then to flee. The final charge, meant to restore Napoleon's glory, instead shattered the illusion that had carried him so far. For Napoleon, it was the cruelest twist of fate. His last gamble had failed. The men he trusted above all others had been turned back, not through lack of courage, but by the sheer resilience and timing of his enemies. As the Guard fell back down the ridge, the Emperor's dream collapsed with them. The Allies surged forward, the Prussians pressed harder on the flank, and what had been a desperate contest became a rout. The final charge of the Imperial Guard was not just a military defeat, it was the breaking of a legend. It marked the moment when the myth of Napoleon's invincibility crumbled before the eyes of Europe. The wall he had built from years of victories and loyalty cracked and fell in an instant, leaving him exposed, vulnerable and beaten. As night fell on Waterloo, the echoes of that charge lingered, a reminder that even the greatest empires can fall in a single, unforgettable moment. The field of Waterloo was silent now, except for the groans of the wounded and the fading echoes of battle. Smoke hung low over the ridges, the stench of gunpowder and death heavy in the air. For Napoleon, the man who had once commanded the destiny of Europe, the silence was not peace, it was the sound of everything slipping away. His last gamble had failed, his guard had been broken, his army, once feared and unstoppable, was now scattered in panic, retreating in confusion across the muddy fields of Belgium. The eagle that had soared above Europe for so many years had finally been struck down. As darkness settled, Napoleon tried to gather what remained of his strength. But there was no turning this tide. The coalition had triumphed. Wellington stood victorious on the ridge, and Blücher's Prussians pressed relentlessly from the flank. The once proud French army was in full flight, its legends shattered. The retreat quickly became a rout, soldiers abandoning weapons, banners falling into enemy hands, discipline collapsing into chaos. For the first time in his glittering career, Napoleon could no longer command the will of his men. Their faith, their belief in his invincibility, had been broken on the fields of Waterloo. The Emperor himself fled the battlefield not with the triumph of past campaigns, but with the heavy weight of finality on his shoulders. He knew what awaited him. In Paris, there would be no more cheering crowds, no more cries of "Vive l'Empereur." The tide of history had turned, and even his own people, weary of endless war and sacrifice, would not stand behind him again. His abdication soon followed, not as a grand gesture of defiance, but as a necessity forced by the reality of defeat. For the second and last time, Napoleon surrendered his throne. This time there would be no escape, no dramatic return from exile, no 100 days to rally his cause. The Allies, determined to end his story once and for all, exiled him to the remote island of St. Helena, far in the South Atlantic. It was a prison without walls, surrounded not by soldiers, but by the endless ocean. There, stripped of power, Napoleon was reduced to a man of memory, reflecting on the glory that had been, the empire that had risen and fallen, and the final defeat that defined his legacy. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon's shadow did not fade. His name carried weight. His story became legend. To some, he was a tyrant who bathed Europe in blood. To others, he was a genius who reshaped the world and inspired loyalty unmatched by any ruler. But what cannot be denied is that Waterloo was the turning point that ended an age. It was the battle that tore down an empire, that reshaped Europe, that closed the book on a man who once seemed larger than history itself. The fall of Napoleon was not simply the fall of a soldier or an emperor, it was the fall of an era. The map of Europe would be redrawn, monarchies restored, and a fragile peace enforced. Yet the memory of the man, his brilliance, his ambition, and his downfall would linger in every capital, in every court, in every army for generations to come. And so, the story ends where ambition met its wall. On a rain-soaked field in Belgium, the dream of an empire dissolved into the mud. Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of battles, the breaker of nations, the legend of his age, was undone not by one enemy, but by all of Europe united. His empire collapsed, his glory faded, but his name, his story endures forever, whispered through time as both a warning and a wonder. The Battle of Waterloo was not only the end of Napoleon, it was the end of an age and the beginning of the world we know today.